Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Avoid Crisis Podcast. This is Ray Ariano with my host, Alan Plyler. And we've got a continuing in our series on end of life issues. And this episode is end of life financial planning. Um, Alan, why don't you say hello, and then we're going to introduce our guest and we're going to jump into some really interesting stuff. Say hi, Alan.
Well, hello, Ray, and good to see you again. And amazing that we're at another avoid crisis episode here. And really happy to have Ed with us today. And nice to meet you, Ed. I've been looking forward to this because one of the things that I've heard over and over is stories where people have said, "Wow, we never knew it was going to cost us this much to be in this situation at the end of life for either themselves or their family or other family members." And really thought it'd be helpful today to have some discussion about how to prepare. And really thought it'd be good in this particular series where we've already talked about some of the issues that can happen to individuals and talked about some of those unfortunate circumstances that occur, and then really being able to say, well, thinking about that in the whole spirit of avoiding crisis, where you think and then you decide, make decisions, and act. What should we be thinking about now when it comes to end of life financial planning? So,
Right.
welcome here today, and looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, so for our audience, Ed Morales is out of Jacksonville, Florida, with the Pinnacle Group. They're a nationwide financial planning group. Ed's been in this industry for decades, although you'd never tell. Ed, there's no way. Welcome to the show, Ed. Say a quick hello, and then we're going to jump into some questions and things.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ray. Appreciate it. And Alan, good to see you.
All right. So we had talked earlier with in-home care specialists. We talked with a palliative care doctor, and each of them, interestingly, had said, and you really got to be aware of some of the costs and what it's going to cost to do these things. This is a nationwide audience, so I want to talk on 2 points to begin with. From what you're seeing and your clients, and so on, what are some of the costs parameters that you run into, and how much of this is covered by Medicare or Social Security or say other types of government programs? Um,
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that there's so many misconceptions around what what Medicare or health care will actually address relative to healthcare expenditures, and also what Medicare and what Social Security will pay from an income perspective. And I think there's just falsehoods and actually awaiting to that day to come along where it's saying everything is taken care of. And I think, unfortunately, in the financial planning processes, there's so much focus really paid on looking at the accumulation phase, accumulating wealth, and there's so little attention that's actually considered around how do you actually distribute the wealth. And I think that's where there's significant disconnect. I think one of the big drains that we see towards any form of financial planning is the lack of planning specifically around long-term care illness or long-term care needs. So as you were mentioning, palliative care, specifically along the same lines with long-term care, I think it is a really deep concern because you see deep attrition, specifically because there's no planning done specifically to mitigate the risk, against those situations. It's all going to happen. I think if every one of us were to look at kind of long-term care, we would simply say that we know of someone or a family member or a friend in some way or fashion has been impacted by it. And I think the realization and the impact, the severity of the financial burden of that is astronomical. So I think it's a missing component of that, where we're sitting there, let's accumulate as much as we can, but then there's less being talked about how do you distribute that? How do you actually do it in a very orderly fashion? So I think that's probably some of the biggest concerns there.
so what we're hearing is Medicare, Social Security's not going to come to the rescue, um, and so people are kind of on their own. Health insurance generally won't cover a lot of these types of costs, or only certain ones, I suppose. Um, your doctor bills and so on. But if you have in-home care needs, it kind of falls through the cracks of conventional insurance. And Yeah, yeah, as you know, Ed, and I don't know, Alan, our audience. One time I had my life in health license. I was my Series 66 life. I dabbled in this area for a while, and long-term care insurance is the product, is the type of policy that
Yeah.
covers these needs, right, Ed?
Yeah. Plus, I even think today, I think there has been so much, the insurance industry has responded. I think long-term care insurance per se has become, a lot of insurance carriers have pulled out of the market just because of the lack of planning per se, or predictability of the number of claims that are happening. So what you've seen is a response specifically for the industry of looking at long-term care, but embedding it in other forms of insurance planning. So where they specifically look at products like annuities or life insurance, where they actually embed it into those products, and that becomes more cost effective and more cost efficient. It is so that those are some of the things that you're seeing. What is the response from an industry that basically had really, this large block of business that basically where there was so much individual long-term care that was being purchased, it ended up basically that the claims exceeded the amount of premiums that the insurance companies were taking out. So they had to look at an alternative to that.
Right. And I think that's a function of people are living longer, people are living longer with needs, with illness, and the cost of care is going up.
Yeah.
I've heard of people spending 25, 30 grand a month to have in-home care in certain situations.
Yeah, there is right now, one of the things that has happened, and it's something that all the listeners should be aware of, is that right now there's a movement. It started with the state of Washington that basically they're actually imposing or suggesting or they're mandating that long-term care be put in place. Specifically in how it's being paid, they're actually doing a payroll tax in the state of Washington. It was 0.58% on payroll. So essentially it's a mandate that if you don't, and it only has a coverage limit of like $36,000, where the average national cost is about 115. So it's something to be aware of, because right now there's about 30% of the states in the country are looking at what happened in the state of Washington. It looks to be slowly migrating in some fashion to California, Pennsylvania, New York. Those are the kind of the states of that. And I think from a planning perspective, a lot of financial advisors and a lot of your listeners certainly should be aware of, what is the response to that? How do you plan for that? And of course, some of the things that the states are allowing is specifically for individuals to opt out, where they can secure their own coverage and not necessarily have to deal specifically with that payroll tax. So again, what you see here is just from a planning perspective, you're also seeing from a national perspective, the concern around long-term care planning or the lack thereof. You'll see various institutions, municipalities, government, if you will, kind of stepping in and saying, what do we need to do this? So that should alert everyone that there's an opportunity in your planning process to look at how long-term care can actually mitigate some of the risk associated with the high costs of expenses for care.
Ed, take, for example, somebody that's in their 20s, somebody in their 30s, someone in their 40s, someone in their 50s. What kind of steps should they be taking at each one of those stages of life if they haven't taken any action at this point? What should they be doing from a financial planning perspective to anticipate this cost?
So, it's a great question, Alan, because typically when you think about the planning phase, especially those younger years that you have that, you got your whole life ahead of you. The thing is that's when you start looking about, as we look at our cast today, is avoiding the crisis. So you can avoid the crisis and mitigate some of the costs associated with the crisis if you start doing it earlier in your life. So it is kind of the wait and see, and I've got time, and that's clearly done. But every year, 5 years, decade, 2 decades that go by, the cost of actually how do you mitigate these risks? How do you use hedging? How do you leverage strategies become more and more costly? You can still do it. So I would certainly recommend, no matter what stage of life that you are, as you're looking at your planning of investments, as you're looking to accumulate wealth, certainly also be mindful of how do you protect that wealth. So I think it's just so important to be able to take advantage of that. Well, certainly in your younger years, that's for sure.
Can you give us a high level? What is long-term care insurance to the average person? A quick summary deaf? What makes it different from other types of insurance?
It's dealing with specifically where there's an ailment or an illness. There is some loss of some ambulatory, skills that you have. You don't have to be in your 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s or beyond that to actually, have benefits from long-term care. But it is, as it sounds, it is care for a long period of time, for a longer period of time. The important thing, and this is kind of a stereotype that exists with long-term care, that you've got to be hospitalized or you got to be in a home to do that. Those years have moved on a long, long time ago. This is about where you need care to the extent where you can actually be in your home, someone actually caring for you. It could simply be that there is not a chronic illness or chronic condition. It could be something where you're basically you're laid up for a long period of time because of whatever reason it may be. So long-term care is providing benefits. You pay a premium for it, but you are able to get a benefit for that actually will in turn pay a benefit for the care that's necessary. And the care can be where somebody is coming in who is a certified care professional to take care of you. Could be somebody that is a caretaker or caregiver for you as well. So there's a lot of different options that are available that now insurance companies give options and to work with. But it's simply, Ray, to your question, it is providing, there's a premium, you get coverage, you get a benefit to take care of needs that you may have. So,
yeah. And my memory from way back when I had my licenses, there are 6 activities of daily living, what they call ADLs.
mm-hmm.
And I think you need to have 2 to trigger the coverage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of them that way?
So it's all different, but by and large, it's usually around 2, yes.
Okay. And the 6 of them, just for our listeners, do you know them off the top of your head? If not, I got them written down.
I don't have them off the top of my head.
Okay. So it's for our listeners, it's bathing, dressing, eating, transferring. So that's moving from one location to another, toileting, and continence.
Yeah.
So if you have problems being able to take care of the 2 or 3 activities of daily living, a long-term care policy could kick in to help pay for in-home care, or even if you're at a facility, for this type of care that you'd need to continue living your life, comfortably.
And I think about it, Ray, to your point there, what's really interesting, I mean, this is not, we're looking at things from a planning perspective, and these are all, these are solutions that are available that you're able to, it's all about leverage. It's like, how do you leverage one asset? And a lot of times you don't use the asset and you can actually get the asset refunded back to you. So it's really important to know that this is just a strategy. It's not so much what they call it, but it's the benefit of. So what I really recommend, because of the fact that it is long-term care planning that goes into this, is simply to look at, I've accumulated resources and wealth, and what are the risks? What are the things that are going to be impacting the most in the future? So when you look at end of life financial planning, you want to make sure what you've planned for is still viable and is still available for the next generation and for the needs that you have to protect the things that you've accumulated.
That's right. People don't save and accumulate wealth so they can spend it on healthcare for the last year and a half of their life. Yet so many people do end up doing that. And when you're at that, toward those later years and in poor health, it's almost impossible to get this coverage at that time. Right. That gets to Alan, to your question.
That's a very big concern. I mean, obviously, when you need it the most, you can't get it. So that's where, to your point, getting it, as Alan referenced earlier, getting it more planning and looking at those options where you're younger, it certainly provides you with a lot more different options to consider.
Yeah, 30s would be great. 40s, they better get moving. By 50s, you're kind of a little bit getting late to the game, it sounds like.
50s is still good, but once you start saying, hey, listen, I need and one of the biggest concerns that we see is not so much for those that have accumulated wealth, but it's actually their parents. It is, how do we care for our parents? And what you'll see, and we've seen this many, many times, that assets have been depleted, specifically because they're caring, because they're doing the loving and kind thing to do. is caring for their parents, but their parents are not properly protected. So what happens is we see that is an area that that's very volatile, because they're needing to take some of the assets they've accumulated to care for their parents because of their health concerns.
Wow, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things too, when we're just talking about the cost, the mean per capita medical spending in the last 12 months of life in the U.S. is really high. It's around $80,000. So if you just think about it, this is $80,000 of cost that if you haven't done any kind of planning for, and that's just today's cost. This isn't, where we're going to be in 10 years. And if you just think about the way medical costs have risen, and so let's just say it's going to be 100,000. How many people are prepared to have an additional 100,000 ready for that moment? Probably very few.
Very few. And even if they are, Alan, to your point, I think that in that context, it's striking a check for 6 figures, not 1 year, but every year for 5 years, if you will. And it's going to be a greater amount than that. It's you're just not prepared for that. So it's just it's so important to be able to look at that and to make sure you're putting those things in place and exploring it. These are, again, as I started off with, we spend a lot of time on building and building and building, and we spend very little time looking on protecting and protecting. So, and a lot of times this is not necessarily about, well, I've got to pay more. When individuals, when proper financial planning is done, we're always looking at essentially how do we reposition or repurpose some of those assets, so that as we're concerned about market volatility, we're also concerned about the inherent risk outside of the market, which is healthcare risk. The most tragic thing to do is to accumulate a lot of wealth, but you're not healthy. So, and health is everything. So the big issue there is looking at, how do I mitigate that risk and just have the proper planning to do so. So it's,
I like how you put that, Ed. Accumulate, protect, distribute when it comes to your wealth. And that distribution happens partly while you're alive, and it happens, then the big distribution happens when you pass. We talked a little bit about long-term care. Let's touch real briefly, just because I think it's an important topic. It could have its whole own episode just on life insurance.
Yeah.
The difference between term versus perm, and how that plays in end of life issues. Obviously, if you've been diagnosed with cancer, stage 4, you can't get insured, right? So same concept. Right. You need to get it earlier on in life. Tell us about term versus perm and what people should think about with life insurance.
Term is a great solution for a short duration. So where there is a specific need or debt within a limited period of time, term is always an excellent tool for that. But in practicality, insurance companies, 1% of all the death benefit claims that are paid out by insurance companies are in term. So the reality is most term policies expire before the benefits are paid. So that's a common denominator with that. But nonetheless, term does have an extraordinary, very practical place, specifically when you look at those ebbs and flows of your life, that you have the necessary coverage to cover specific debt, whether it's for a business or whether it's for personal. So that's one. The other forms of insurance, they're more in the line of what I would kind of categorize as permanent insurance, where that's where you're seeing most of the 99% of the benefits that are paid, globally, certainly here in the United States, is coming from permanent insurance. And there's different variations, but typically in some form of permanent insurance, it has a death benefit. It has some mechanism where it's building up a value inside the contract. And how that contract is built can be based on an interest rate, can be based on a guaranteed basis from the insurance company. So there's different variations. In some cases, they're variable, where there's what one would consider sub-accounts, where there's almost like investment accounts affiliated with it, where you can select either aggressive, conservative, more moderate, or types of options within a contract. But the most important thing about both, broadly speaking, contracts, term insurance is for a very specific period of time. Permanent insurance is there as it sounds. It's for the permanent allocation. So to the time that's needed. So, and typically in generational or estate planning purposes, permanent insurance is always used to do that.
Any discussion about beneficiaries on these policies?
Beneficiaries is a big deal, Ray. That's beneficiaries is a big thing across the board. Even in our conversation, as we look at financial planning and the end of life, so much is done in accumulation, a little bit about distribution. But one of the things that we see time and time again that is missed is specifically who are going to be the benefactors of this. Have you had the conversation? Do they know where everything is at? So the estate planning piece of it is not just about the assets, but it's about the intentions that you have specifically and how you want and who you want it to go to. What we find time and time again is that the next generation, the kids, family, friends, they have no idea that this is forthcoming, and they're not prepared to be able to handle the landscape of those resources that are coming to them, whatever it may be. So I think it's important that those conversations from a planning perspective is just not happening with your advisor, with yourself. It's also recognizing that you've got to bring other family into that, specifically if they're going to be the beneficiaries of that. We typically see that beneficiaries are limited just to primary beneficiaries. There's no contingent beneficiaries. So it's just really important that you kind of live out what the beneficiary, points would be.
One thing that's I think kind of helpful sometimes is just to give an example of something that you've experienced. I know, Ray, we talked before about issues from beneficiaries. Ed, maybe you can talk about some situations where end-of-life care ended up being an exorbitant cost that no one had prepared for. Maybe just give a couple examples of something that's happened that kind of illustrates just things that you should be thinking about or what potentially can happen. Sometimes a real-life example really brings it home.
Real life example. I mean, some of the more prominent families in the United States, that we know of where they didn't do proper planning, and some of them are baseball owners, and what you found is that basically they didn't do any estate planning, and what they find is that at the time of death, 50 to 60 to even 70% of their entire wealth was actually was paid out in 9 months because of federal state taxes. One of the things, so this estate planning, this end of life planning, is just not for. It's for all of us. It is not. You can have and been blessed with a certain amount of things that you've been able to accumulate. It's important. It is what your intentions are with that, but also knowing that even if you have, if you're high net worth and you have extraordinary wealth, it is one of the things that's happening right now. And I know that, my friends on the call here that are CPAs, in 2026, there's a sunset that's coming about. You guys can talk about more than I can, but right now, the estate planning, the side of estates where they are right now, in some fashion, it's gonna come down. So the implications of that is meaning where, maybe you had this exemption at a larger amount. Well, maybe it's only going to be, I don't know, maybe it's only going to be 5 million. So what's going to happen here is the guys and gals, the families that were saying, I'm okay because the exemption is taking me on forever, that's going to be changing. And if families and individuals are not looking and starting to have those discussions today, you've got to have those plans in place well before the sunset in 2026. It's got to be looked at now. So I think it's just really important to look at, why does insurance work? Because it's a leverage asset. It's an asset that is something that can be used, that you buy, that you can repurpose wealth that you have and use it and still maintain control of that, but do it for as many times it says as pennies on the dollar.
Yeah, that's a great point about the sunset of the current. We have extraordinarily high, unprecedented high limits on the estate tax, and that all resets 2026. So there's a lot of planning that should be done over the next few years in preparation for that. I want to make a really quick point, Ed. You kind of reminded me there on the beneficiary on the life insurance side.
Yes.
Listeners, do not make your trust the beneficiary of your life insurance policy. Repeat, do not make your trust the beneficiary of life insurance policy.
Agreed.
Right? I mean,
Agreed.
we've seen this happen. I got a call a couple months ago about this very issue, and it's just, yeah, it's a mess. Yeah. Have your advisors tell you later why.
Yeah, the issue is what we also see is the estate, where they make the estate the benefactor. And of course, when you make the estate the benefactor see, the thing about life insurance, Ray, what you're getting at is that life insurance supersedes probate. In other words, it's not going to go to probate. It goes directly to the beneficiary. When you put your estate on there as beneficiary, your estate goes to probate. And then basically, then you're dealing with how distribution is going to be. And then what happens is that you'll have a lot of individuals that may be affiliated with the family, could be a relative. And now we get into all of the dance about who's better entitled, who should have got it. And it's sad enough that death occurs, and you know, it's certainly it is the way of life, but it becomes even more specifically sadful when you see the bickering and the disjointed behaviors of families, and it happens all the time, where there's just misunderstandings, and everyone is laying claim to, he loved me better and she loved me better than you, and it just becomes, and it's so unnecessary. So I think the advice there is, at all costs, please don't ever put your estate.
You know, you bring up an interesting point, and I just think in general that maybe we should talk about this. I think that in a lot of the effort to avoid crisis, you need to get the right advice. And I know, Ray, as a CPA, you've given tremendous advice to people and helped them to do planning. Ed, I'm sure in all the work that you've done in financial planning, and it has really helped a lot of people as well. And I think it's just a point that, you know, you need the advice of an attorney at times, you need the advice of a CPA, and you need the advice of a financial planner to help prepare and avoid crisis. Maybe, Ed, you can give a little bit of detail on how to contact you if any of the listeners are interested in learning more of your services.
I liked a couple on what you just said there. I think it's so essential that when you're in a planning phase, I mean, none of us are mutually exclusive. I think that to do proper planning, you need to have a good CPA, you need to have a good attorney, and you need to have a good financial advisor. To the extent that any of us would say, well, I do it all, I don't think it's prudent and wise, but I think it's certainly important to be able to look at a multidisciplinary approach with the right professionals to do that. Plus, in getting individuals that are listening, that are just not knocking on the door and coming up with an immediate solution after a 5-minute conversation. It really should be where you're listening and you're feeling comfortable. There's a lot of us out there, and there's a lot of good ones out there. There's also a lot out there that are very transactionally based, and we would encourage you to steer away from them. Talk to people that you're comfortable with. Talk with people that have the professional designations, and those that are, even after all that you know that they care about what you care about. So to get a hold of me, again, my name is Ed Morales. My email address is probably best, and it's Edgar, EDGAR .Morales, MORALES. That's at Pinnacle, which is PINNACLEIFS, insurancefinancialservices.com.
Sounds great. Thank you, Ed. So I did have one last area I want to touch on. We were about to turn the corner to wrap, and I went back through my notes to see if we covered everything, and we missed one point. I just want to try to squeeze in if we can in the last couple of minutes. We didn't talk about like bank accounts, brokerage accounts, qualified plan accounts. I mean, qualified plan meaning like IRAs, 401ks, that kind of stuff. From a financial planning perspective, you know, avoid crisis, analyze, decide, act. What should our listeners think about with regard to bank accounts, brokerage accounts, qualified plan accounts?
So I think what's interesting about that, number one, I think, in the qualified sense, which is, you know, obviously your IRA accounts, your pension accounts, I would say anything that has any tax deferred mechanism. In most states, obviously first of all, those products enable you to have a beneficiary. So I think it's very important to do that. With your bank accounts, a TOD, a transfer on death, if not in place, should be in place. Sometimes we see a lot of times where there is just one individual, or in fact, there's just a husband and wife. So it's just very important that you put a TOD on all of those types of bank accounts, brokerage accounts. They all allow you to do that. They all have specific means to be able to have, the assets with that. In the absence of not having a beneficiary, as already has been mentioning, within those contracts, then it's actually deferred to the estate. Of course, we know it's about probate. Same holds true with bank accounts and brokerage accounts. If you don't have a TOD, if it's not noted in some form of planning, from an estate planning, wills and trust and so forth, the reality is that those accounts can be locked until actually the court system actually opens it up for you, or somebody stands up, there's a representative to the estate. So those things become a little bit more convoluted and complex. So the thought is there is on a bank account, a brokerage account, certainly a minimum is looking at a TOD. Anything on those other qualified accounts, they do permit for beneficiaries. I would certainly suggest to the audience that you check that to make sure you have the right beneficiary on there. So you have a contingent beneficiary. So the real neat thing about those other assets that are qualified in most states, and a lot of states, those assets are protected. They're credit proof. So there's a lot of opportunity with those assets. We see a lot of times in the planning that they utilize those types of vehicles specifically because they're protected. Those assets protected from creditors and so forth.
Wow, so many things to think about. Alan, any final questions for Ed as we're wrapping up here?
Well, I think we've certainly touched on a lot of these issues, and I really think that, again, to remind listeners that this is something that is going to be something you will be facing. So it's really good to be thinking about it now and thinking about how you can really plan ahead and avoid a crisis, because this end of life cost is one that's very difficult to avoid, and it's one that you should be planning for. And I think with the assistance of a financial planner like Ed, I think it's really going to be something that will help to avoid crisis. And I hope our listeners really are going to take that to heed. And it's been really enjoyable to have you here, Ed. We enjoy having guests that know so much more than we do and can help our listeners, and really appreciate all the comments today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. And, the end of life crisis, it unfortunately is usually the responsibility is borne by others, not ourselves, because we end up actually at some point passing. And then what's left is what the families and friends have to contend with. So a lot of this is about just what we're looking at, but also the impact that this is going to make on those we really care for. So, but it's been a joy, pleasure, guys. Thank you for inviting me in. Enjoy the questions, and certainly if any listeners have any questions for me and so forth, I'll be available to assist as best I can.
Sounds great. That's edgar.morales@pinnacleifs.com. Thanks again, Ed. Thanks, Alan. Our next episode, to our listeners, we're going to be talking with the trust and estate attorney about things that you want to have, legal documents and legal issues when we talk about end-of-life considerations. Until then, thanks again, and we'll talk to you in a couple weeks. Bye-bye.